So this extract from the Prelude is about a real moment in William Wordsworth's childhood. It comes from a larger text which describes a lot of his feelings about nature and growing up. And it's about a real memory of stealing a boat as a boy, borrowing it really, and going on a small ride through these lakes. What happens in the poem is that Wordsworth begins to feel as he's rowing his boat, going across the waves of the lake, kind of a sense of power over nature. He feels in control, he feels good, he takes in all the beauty of his surroundings. But as the poem progresses, he sees this enormous peak, like the peak of a mountain, and it feels threatening to him. What he realises is that nature is quite a lot more powerful than he anticipated, and he realises that nature possibly has a lot of power over human beings. It's beyond something that we can control. So really that's the gist of the poem. It describes an event of him rowing out on a boat, returning in fear, but underneath it all is this message, this theme of his changing perception of nature. Contextually then, where that comes from is that William Wordsworth was part of a whole movement of poets that we now call the Romantic movement. They were interested in nature. They felt that nature had a great power and should be respected. And they were also interested in deep human emotions. They weren't trying to be extremely realistic. Instead, they were trying to express the feelings and the emotions and the internal thoughts that human beings experience. And we see both of those things in this poem. That it's about nature, but it's also about his feelings about nature. Some more context you could put into an essay, or you could try to analyse, would be the fact this was written during the Industrial Revolution. Well, with factories and mines and new inventions popping up all over the place, coal was being used in new ways, pollution was coming into the cities, and so people were very aware of the ways in which humans were trying to control nature, to use nature in a way that they hadn't before. That means that people like Wordsworth might have been troubled or concerned by the changes they were seeing in the landscape, the move from the country to the city, the changes in the city, the new pollution that was happening, the destruction of old natural environments. And so you could possibly read the whole poem as a kind of a metaphor or a commentary on the way that not just this boy in the boat, but all human beings have a kind of a complicated relationship with nature. We try to control it, but ultimately that can have drastic consequences, and it's a force that's beyond simple human control. So let's have a look at that poem and let's see if we can spot some of those themes in this narrative about the boat. It goes like this. Wordsworth says, "One summer evening, led by her, I found a little boat tied to a willow tree within a rocky cove, its usual home. Straight I unloosed her chain and stepping in pushed from the shore. It was an act of stealth and troubled pleasure, nor without the voice of mountain echoes did my boat move on, leaving behind her still on either side small circles glittering idly in the moon, until they melted all into one track of sparkling light. But now, like one who rows, proud of his skill to reach a chosen point, with an unswerving line I fixed my view upon the summit of a craggy ridge, the horizon's utmost boundary. Far above was nothing but the stars and the grey sky. She was an elfin pinnace. Lustily I dipped my oars into the silent lake, and as I rose upon the stroke my boat went heaving through the water like a swan. When from behind that craggy steep, till then the horizon's bound, a huge peak, black and huge, as if with voluntary power instinct, upreared its head, I struck and struck again, and growing still in stature the grim shape towered up between me and the stars, and still, for so it seemed, with purpose of its own, and measured motion like a living thing, strode after me. With trembling oars I turned, and through the silent waters stole my way, back to the covert of the willow tree. There in her mooring place I left my bark, and through the meadows homeward went, in grave and serious mood. But after I had seen that spectacle for many days, my brain worked with a dim and undetermined sense of unknown modes of being. Oh, my thoughts there hung a darkness. Call it solitude or blank desertion. No familiar shapes remained, no pleasant images of trees, of sea or sky, no colours of green fields, but huge and mighty forms that do not live like living men, moved slowly through the mind by day, and were a trouble to my dreams. So we see in that poem the kind of twist that happens, that from the middle and the beginning we've got kind of beauty of nature, this human being who seems to have power over nature. He's in this boat, he calls it an elfin pinnace, elfin meaning like an elf, so it almost feels like a fantasy, like a dream. Pinnace, a type of boat. And he dips his oars, he's taking pleasure in it, he's rising up, feels like he's like a swan, feels graceful. But then there's almost a separation right in the middle. In poetry we call it a volta, V-O-L-T-A. There's a switch that happens right in the middle in tone, from the kind of beauty and power you have beforehand to the fear and dread that he feels when he sees this craggy ridge, this hill, turn into a huge peak, great mountain that he feels threatened by. And that's why he's troubled. We have the final line, a trouble to my dreams. So we see his view of nature has really changed and become threatened, troubled. Let's have a look at some of the word choices and some of the interesting techniques that are being used in this poem. These are things that we could write about in the exam. We firstly get, on the first line, this description that he's led by her. Well, there is no woman in this poem, so we have to read this as possibly metaphorical. Possibly the her he's talking about is nature. Often nature is referred to as Mother Nature. It's described like a woman. So what he's doing here is probably personifying nature, personifying it, turning it into a human, as if he's tempted by it, like it's a romantic relationship. And we get lots of other romantic terms used throughout the poem. He says that when he's rowing he feels lusty, so he's almost aroused, he feels desire towards nature during this moment. And like men possibly felt over women in Wordsworth's time, he feels a kind of control over it, kind of power in the relationship. He feels desire towards it, but it's also something he can control. And that's what's interesting about the phrase led by her. He's not saying it, nature isn't it here, it's her. It's like a woman that he's imagining, personifying. We also get beautiful imagery in the first half. You notice these mentions of stars. It doesn't say stars, but it says small circles glittering idly in the moon. You can imagine the glittering light. This is a very beautiful image. It's almost like small diamonds, sparkling light. It's lighting his way. Light is always symbolic of things that are holy and beautiful. It's the opposite of darkness, which is mysterious. And of course, later on, we get the simile, like a swan, which kind of ends that beautiful section. He describes himself as being like a swan, and we know that a swan is something that moves very gracefully, very fluidly. There's no danger to a swan, it doesn't feel like. And because it's so graceful and so powerful, that possibly mirrors some of what he's feeling in the water. That he's a being of beauty and grace, just in the midst of all this nature, which he feels really at home with, as if he's meant to be there. That changes pretty quick, and we see it change with this repetition. A huge peak, black and huge. We mentioned already, black can be symbolic of darkness, mystery, the unknown, fear. But notice how he's repeated the word huge. If you were doing that on a creative writing exam, you might say that's not very effective writing, that's almost a lazy choice. And I think that's interesting for someone like Wordsworth, who's obviously got a very wide vocabulary. He repeats the word huge twice. Not a complex word either, a simple word. Huge. So he's really emphasising the size of this thing, possibly to show how intimidating he feels that nature can be. I also feel like he's possibly lost for words at this point. Notice how he uses the same word twice. He then uses it again. He says, I struck and struck again. This is not very thoughtful language. So it's almost like he's so afraid that he's lost for words. He's struggling to express himself, which we see even more through all the punctuation in this part. Notice at the start of the second section, all these commas, the full stop in the middle. In poetry we call it a caesura, stop in the middle of a sentence, like he stopped dead in his tracks. And finally, we get a long list at the end. Notice how he uses parallel structure. No familiar shapes remained. No pleasant images of trees. No colours of green fields. When you do this in speech-making parallelism, it's usually an opportunity for the speaker to emphasise the word even stronger every time. No familiar shapes, no pleasant images, no colours. And each time we're really getting the sense that there really is nothing left for him, no sense of beauty left. His view of nature, as a kind of a beautiful fantasy, has been completely stripped, all gone. And so that's an interesting phrase to remember and to talk about the listing and the repetition that's being used there. Once you understand the poem then, the best thing to do in the exam is to compare it. You're asked to compare it to one other poem, so you have to make a choice about that. Some poems that you could compare it to would be Exposure by Wilfred Owen. Of course, in that poem, it's also describing the dangers of nature, the threatening aspects of nature, as the soldiers in the trenches face the literal threat to their lives of the extreme cold and the horrible environment, the terrain that they were in. Very similar to Wordsworth's sense that he's threatened by this huge peak. Likewise, in War Photographer, we get someone reflecting, memorialising, remembering a horrific experience that happened to them. In War Photographer, it was that they felt they had control over the camera, the frame, and they really realised that they don't have control over the situations that they photograph, much the same as Wordsworth is trying to extract this beautiful poetry out of nature, but then realises it's beyond his control. Sennacherib would also be an interesting poem where we realise that human beings lack power. In Sennacherib, what it shows is the power of God as a mighty force. Wordsworth doesn't talk about God here, instead he talks about nature, but they'd both be enormous personified forces that human beings don't have control over. So have a think about what quotations you might pick out of this poem, how you might compare them, and what interesting techniques you might think are paralleled between those poems that you might be able to compare in the exam. Good luck.